Hey everybody, how are you tonight? Today is Tuesday. It's the 26th, which means the month is almost up. I think, 2 weeks into having received the PPP money and just now trying to figure out how the freak I'm supposed to spend it. So if you guys have some resources for how to figure that out, I'd sure love to hear from it. It's just me tonight. What I wanted to do was just share a few things that I've been thinking about. My brain's been deep on some systems level thinking things that I've been trying to work through. You guys know that I've really been focusing on that of late. So what I want to do is just talk a little bit about what I've done in my office, just because I think it's dorky and might be interesting to you. But also this issue of conspiracy theories and some research on it. My friend Nika Kabiri wrote a post about it today, and it's really helpful, and how it applies to business. And also a bit about these two stories with racism rearing its head again in a systemic way, and wanted to talk about that. So first, just for a little fun, I wanted to show you guys my office. I posted about it on Twitter today. It's a legit blanket fort. I'm a grown-ass man with a blanket fort. Do you see that? These are these curtains that I bought. I had my daughter's room, but she kicked me out because this thing is just lasting too long. And so I bought these floor-to-ceiling soundproof curtains. They're not soundproof. I have to get everybody to go hide in their rooms. But seriously, it's a legit blanket fort. I now work in the midst of a blanket fort, but I've got space for my Post-it notes. I haven't quite figured out the lighting in this area yet. It's really weird because once I get it set up, there's no warm lights, right? There's just the cool lights, just the blue-white lights that I have. So my wife is going to help me figure that out. But I just wanted to point out that I'm legit broadcasting from a blanket fort because I'm a grown-ass man. So also, I wanted to share just a couple of articles with you. First was this one from an outlet called Undark, and it talks about the allure and psychology of conspiracy theories. The reason that I find this so interesting is, one, it makes the point that we're not, even though everybody's talking about conspiracy theories right now, mainly for political reasons, we don't see an uptick in the belief in conspiracy theories. We're at about the level that we have been historically, with just a couple of spikes. They talk about communism as a big spike that happened in terms of conspiracy theory belief, but they talk about the psychology of conspiracy theories, and basically what it comes down to is a sense of order, that people like the belief that there's causality when it's not there, that there's somebody to blame, that there's this sense of order. And I find this really interesting. I've been doing a lot of research on this in law, and want to talk about that a little bit, especially right now in COVID, this sense that we have no control and therefore we're going to assign some meaning to things that aren't there. But then on the flip side, what I think lawyers do is they pretend that everything is, it depends, right? Everything is so complex and so confusing that there's not a lot of control. And so it's a hard balance. Specifically I wanted to share this piece from Nika Kabiri. She's a friend of mine who, she has a JD, but thankfully does not, for her anyway, does not practice in law anymore. She's really good at what she does now, and I'm really glad that she's doing that. She used to work at Avo. She was in consumer level research. But she's got this piece on some of the biases that inform conspiracy theories and how they relate to us making business decisions. And that's where the rubber really meets the road for me in this moment, is thinking about how law firms, how lawyers deal with complexity in their business design. I'm about to start working on a piece that's about this, so I don't want to reveal too much because I'm still working on the research. But in short, sort of the idea that I have loosely held in my brain, writing tip, by the way, you always want to start with an idea loosely held, right? You want something in your mind, some place you're trying to get to, but you're okay with, if new information moves you as you do some research. But the loosely held idea I have right now is that basically lawyers, because we make money off of people feeling the world's far too confusing, therefore you need us, we start doing some self-talk about that as well, that it's too confusing for us, and therefore we have to follow this prescribed model. We can't think through a different kind of business model. We can't think through a different way to sort of approach the complexity that is around us. So we might say things like, well, the courts would never allow that, or the legislature will never bend on this. The code says so and so. I shared the story in the book about the ethics experts talking about flat fees, and basically they were talking about the rules, the model rules, the ABA rules, as if they're like the Bible, like God wrote them and not people, and that it can't be messed with. And so we tend to tackle complexity in a way that makes us feel powerless. And I'm not saying to go so far as to jump into being conspiracy theorists about the state bar or law schools, or assign all these bad intent things when they're not. I mean, they may not even be there. Some people certainly have selfish intentions, but most of the thing is, it's systems level feedbacks, and everybody's just acting as humans. And so this piece that I'm going to be working on and digging into is about that. Like, if I'm building a law firm, design thinking, for example, is it's narrow, right? It's supposed to be narrow. You're trying to make the door the best door possible, and you can see as an engineer the tangible results of that door opening, right? But if I'm building a law firm, it's not like that, right? This is not a narrow thing. There are perceptions, there are relationships. It's a lot of complexity, and so right now we sort of don't design our law firms. We just kind of stumble through stuff. And so this piece, what I'm thinking about is, how do you deal with complexity? So those are two articles on that idea, and one about your business decisions. I think it's really interesting. I've talked about the book before, Everyday Chaos, and what to do. Like, basically the control was always an illusion that started with the Greeks, and now we're all just sort of having to come to terms with it. So what do you do? What do you do when you realize that control is an illusion, but you still have to make decisions? There's still, strategy is not understanding some massive plan. It's figuring out the next thing. It's a really interesting area in terms of decision science. Nobody knows that stuff better than Nika Kabiri, so I recommend her article. Last thing. I am going to step into this conversation about two news stories that came out in the last 24 hours. One is this Central Park, the story of this lady in Central Park who, while she was out walking her dog, if you don't know the story, then I'll give you guys an article to read through. It really gets through some of the issues really well. But anyway, there was a lady who was out walking, and she just got a dog from a rescue. It was sort of a mess. She was sort of running all over the place trying to deal with this dog. There was a man who was birding, looking for birds in this part of Central Park that dogs are supposed to be on leashes so they don't chase the birds away. He happened to be African American. He starts recording her. She says on this video, "I'm going to call the police and tell them that an African American man is stalking me, is messing with me." And as this very sort of oddly specific threat, it's weird that she keeps using the term African American, and she keeps calling him sir. It looks it was sort of racism by the script, if that makes any sense. I mean, she was saying the things you're supposed to say, but the core of what she was doing was still threatening something very specific, very, very kind of weird, that if I call the police on an African-American man, that you're going to have some kind of different outcome. And within the same day, you got this story of 4 Minnesota police officers who, one of the officers held the man down. I think they were arresting him for forgery, was what I had read. Presumably check fraud or something. I don't know. I haven't read. There's not a ton of information about this yet. But this video got out, this horrific video of a police officer has this man on the ground, and he is leaning his knee on his neck, and the man eventually chokes and dies. And the man is saying during the arrest, I can't breathe. Today it was announced that 4 police officers have been fired in connection with this thing. Now, again, I don't want to get into, I'm not trying to assign any particular intentions to either of these people, and I'm certainly not trying to justify their actions. In my research, I'm sort of at a place where I'm thinking less of persons, right, individual people, and I'm thinking more of systems level harms. And this is a great example of that, I think, when you can say something like, I'm going to call the police. That's not the threat. Calling the police is not the threat. I'm going to call the police and tell them there's an African-American man messing with me, and that's the threat. Now you've gotten to systems level harms. And that it ends up in justice issues that are transactional. Justice is experienced on an individual level, but it's informed on systems levels, which I know that sounds nerdy. It's really interesting to me. I've been trying to get through this book. I keep thinking as I'm doing it, and so I slow down. But really interesting study in here about the rise in incarceration of minorities at the same time that there was a huge decrease in the incidence of violent crimes. So you had this really strange correlation that a lot more people were being arrested, and specifically minorities, in this really hugely disproportionate way, while violent crime is going down. And so they tried to figure out what this is, because simple causal relationships weren't making a lot of sense. And in the end, after gauging a lot of different feedback loops and how it was informing the way cops were making decisions, and judges and juries and whatever, all these stacked up, statistical twists that were adding up to really bad outcomes, really disproportionate outcomes. What they found was it wasn't the presence of increased risk. It wasn't the presence of increased harm. It was the perception of increased risk, right? They could measure an increase in fear of minority men. And so that was the feedback loop that was causing all kinds of downstream justice issues. I've told the story many times of when I was in the Children's Rights Clinic at Texas. I remember going in one day and my advisor, Lori, was sitting at her desk and she was crying. And we represented kids in CPS cases. The state had removed the child for neglect or abuse. We represented the children. And so she was crying at her desk, and I asked her, I said, "Are you okay? What's going on?" And she pointed to the list of new clients. And I said, "Okay, we had a new child that we represented, and Lori had represented the mother of that child when she was in law school." Does that make sense? So it was generational, recurrence of coming back into that system. That is not a transaction harm. That is a systems level harm, right? When you've got these systemic issues that are leading people to come back, and that injustice, even though Lori could look back at her case and the way she handled it back when she was in law school, she could easily say, "Dude, I handled this correctly. I cared about justice for this child. I did exactly what I was supposed to do." But if we as lawyers only think reductively, if we only think in the transaction, this is the issue with learning by the case method. We think of everything in like little bubbles, or we think it depends. We're either really narrow, really specific, right? Or the world is just too complex to know. And if we think that way, we can't get at a lot of places where injustice happens. And so, I don't know. These are things that I'm researching about, writing about, doing some work on, and so these stories really hit me today. Again, I'm not trying to apologize for either of these actors, either the woman in the park or the officers involved. I don't want to assign intentions to them. The stories will come out. The facts will come out. I imagine both will be in courts at some point, and a lot of the facts will be evaluated. Not my job to chase these people down and I just don't know enough at this point about their intentions. What I do know is that it sent signals about these system-level issues. And what I would encourage you as lawyers to do is to stop simply saying, "It depends," and stop simply looking at complexity as some vagary that you can't get a hold of. And in your business-making decisions, to get back to what Nike said, stop just thinking that you can't do strategy because the world's the world's crazy. We're in the middle of COVID. The world is crazy, but you can still make decisions. It's all about thinking about the horizon, the degree of control that you believe you have and what you actually have, and where you set your expectations. And so there will be more on that. In the meantime, I would just remind everybody, if you want to participate in these conversations and we can have interviews and just chat with each other, I'm doing these each night at 9 p.m. You can just go to calendly.com/lawyerforward. You'll see the post on there or the link on there for Facebook Live. You can schedule a session at 9 p.m. Central one of these days. I will gladly have a chat with you. And also, don't forget, on Sunday, Nick and I are doing Ask Twinsies. So using the hashtag AskTwinsies, you can ask questions about whatever. I hope you guys are well, and I will see you tomorrow night. Have a good night.